Morning, and really interested to hear what Prof Quinot has to say about this book that he has written, co-written or contributed towards, and there are three other authors in addition to Prof Quinot. Now, if for those of you who don't know, Prof is a professor of law in Stellenbosch University and is probably recognized as one of the more outstanding professors in particularly in public procurement law, and he certainly is for many of us the go-to person on South African, and international public procurement law. So, Prof, welcome, and looking forward to hearing about this new book.
Thank you very much, Sean. It's always very nice to join you on this channel, and of course, for an academic. There are very few things that's nicer than talking about your own publications, especially when it's a book, because these days things do tend to take years and years and years, and it's they become like little kids that you give birth to. That not as a male that I will even claim that I've got any way of understanding that. So to all the women, I'm not claiming that. But one does tend to develop a very intimate relationship with something like a book, and it's accordingly very nice to have an opportunity to talk about it. So thank you for the invitation, Sean. Perhaps also for this particular audience, it might be worthwhile just pointing out that this is somewhat of a segue from our usual focus on procurement, on SCM, but make no mistake, this is still very much within that same wheelhouse, and within my particular broad interest and my kind of research field that I'm primarily interested in, which really goes back to my doctorate almost 20 years ago now, is really in the state as a commercial actor. How do we understand a public sector entity, as in South Africa we call an organ of state, when it operates in the market, when it becomes a commercial actor? How do we just conceptualize that? How do we understand that? And then, since I'm at least originally a lawyer, I tend to look at this from a legal and a governance point of view. And this work is still very much in that space, although now we're looking at a slightly different angle, and that is to say, well, what happens if this public entity can no longer service its debt? What are the consequences? And of course, for suppliers in the procurement context, that remains a critically important question, because when you supply to the state, or when you supply generally, let's just think about your general supply, you take a view on the risk of not being paid for your goods or services, and then you put all kinds of mechanisms in place to protect yourself against that risk materializing. Now, when you deal with a private sector entity, your ultimate protection, of course, is in law itself, in the form of insolvency, that you can actually, as a creditor, apply to have your debtor liquidated, and then to get your performance, or at least part of it, if you're unlucky, out of that process. And that's the real backstop. That's really what in law we would think of as the real final safety net. Of course, you hope that you will never get to that point, but you are always, as a business person, operating under that, under those conditions. And in the market, we consider that to be very important. So in all market-based systems around the world, the quality of market engagement, of transacting, is significantly influenced by the quality of what we would generally, in very broad terms, call financial distress rules. So that is, what do we do with a debtor or a commercial actor that becomes distressed, cannot service its debts? Because that then, of course, undermines transacting. It undermines the commercial transaction. And the more sophisticated your market is, the more you are inclined to attract commerce, the more attention you will give to your insolvency, or then financial, I shouldn't say insolvency. Insolvency is just one part of it. It's financial distress rules. So in the normal commercial market, the general market, this is a very common phenomenon, and all commerce happens on that basis. But when we then step into the public sector participation in the market, and that's really, procurement is the best primary example, that intersection of the public sector and the normal commercial market, things become a little bit more tricky. And this is what this work really explores. And this is basically the first proper book on the topic. And we are, with this book and also the broader project that I'll talk about in a moment, we are trying to kind of push this area to say a lot of more attention needs to be paid to the governance within this area and how we understand financial distress in a public sector context. We started in this project specifically with municipalities, because worldwide, as is absolutely also the case in South Africa, municipalities, local government entities, are really the ones that are the primary actors within the market from a public sector perspective, right? And I mean, this is something, Sean, that we've spoken about often also on this channel, that there's this weird misconception that when we talk about public procurement, or we talk about the state as a commercial actor, we tend to focus a lot on national and a little bit on provincial, but not enough on local. And when you look at the figures, and the most recent figures we've seen in South Africa absolutely bear that out, the vast bulk of transacting, of actually spending money in the market comes from local government. I mean, the figures dwarf what national and provincial do. I mean, in my view, if we take any approach, whether it's an auditing materiality or a project management 80-20 or whatever you want to think about, any of those approaches, and we apply to this context, we should really just be spending almost all our time on local government procurement. The rest becomes almost immaterial in terms of volume and money, etc. So that's why in this project, we also thought, let's start by looking at municipalities in distress, because they are the primary actors in the commercial market. And this is really what the book is all about. So the book is called Municipalities in Financial Distress, an Environmental, Social and Governance Critique. So let me just talk very briefly about the book itself, and then I want to talk about a little bit what kind of the South African angle to all of this is. So I am one of the 4 authors of the book. So in this endeavor, I was joined by 3 colleagues from different parts of the world. Dr. Eugenio Vaccari, who is at the Royal Holloway University of London. Professor Laura Coordes, who's at Arizona State University in the US. Professor Yseult Marique, who is currently mostly based at the University of Essex, but also based part-time in Belgium, University of Louvain. And then myself. And we are the 4 co-authors of this book. That's just come out about 2-3 months ago with Edward Elgar. Now, this book is the product, the first product of a much bigger research project that we are leading with 1 or 2 other colleagues from accounting, called the Research Network on Public Authorities and Financial Distress. And this is a global project where we are bringing together researchers, academics across disciplines interested in looking at the financial distress of public authorities, broadly speaking. So in this project, it's a very broad project, broad focus. It's multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral, international network. We've got at the moment about 60 mostly academics, a few practitioners. These are lawyers, economists, accountants, experts from other disciplines, management sciences, working in this area. And we are, with this project, promoting the development of comparative and iterative research based on concrete case studies. So we are really studying actual instances of financial distress and the entire ecosystem around that, and then trying to pull out from various disciplinary perspectives, so finance, accounting, law, public administration, going for the broad range of disciplines, insights from those case studies to understand what works and what does not work. And then what we're really aiming to do is to come up with some recommendations that can be useful in dealing with this within particular systems, and how do we actually manage this kind of scenario. Now, the focus of the book is really this. It's that the treatment of municipalities in financial distress is largely an underexplored area of law. This is, we're talking now at the international level, not just in South Africa, across the board. The rules in this area are often unaffected by the legal principles developed in insolvency and restructuring law. This is really interesting because it suggests that we've really got a gap here. We've got a regulatory or a governance gap. We've got an actor participating in the market where a key aspect of the market and the rules governing the market is this financial distress. What do we do when somebody can't pay your debt? But then we've got a massive actor with massive activity within that market that's simply not covered. Not just at a positive legal rule, so, you know, whether there's a statute or something like that, that comes later. Just the principles of how do we deal with this kind of scenario? What is an equitable way if there are, for example, multiple creditors? What do we do? And these are the principles that's developed in all systems, as I've said, around financial distress, insolvency or restructuring law. Different systems call it different things. In South Africa, we don't have a single term for it. We deal with it in different parts of the law. But generally, dealing with municipalities as financially distressed commercial actors is something that's not well understood, and that's certainly not governed. And yet, when a municipality fails financially, it has a huge impact, not just on its creditors, and that's really important, also on the local, the regional, the national government, the economies, the residents, investors, and of course also on general creditors. And that's the focus of this work. And within this work, we then say the problem statement is that when a corporation, a private commercial actor, experiences financial distress, the most likely outcome is its liquidation. That's the backstop. We liquidate it, we distribute its assets amongst its creditors. But in stark contrast, municipalities cannot simply, and we put that very, advisedly, intentionally, the word simply in there, be liquidated. It's not that simple. You can't just distribute the assets of a municipality. Unlike distressed corporations, a municipality must continue to exist. And that's across the board, whether, as in South Africa, municipalities have got constitutional status, so they created within our supreme law, and for that very reason must continue to exist. Or you've got a system where that's not the case, like the US, where municipalities are purely the product of state law. It doesn't really matter. In all systems, the local form of government must continue to exist. There must be something like that. So you can't really just liquidate it. It's not really possible. And what we then argue in this book is that municipal distress should be addressed with environmental, social, and governance, ESG considerations in mind. If we are interested in developing a really sustainable solutions to put a municipality back in a financially healthy position and have long-term solutions to this. And of course, anyone that spent kind of 2 minutes in South Africa would know that this really hits home for us. For us, this is a daily reality. It's not something strange. So that, really by way of very broad background. And if we then bring that home, of course, I mean, I don't really need to say much about this. I think everybody on the channel would be very familiar with this. But we know that in South Africa, this is a big problem. If we look, for example, at the 2022 State of Local Government's Finance Report from Treasury, there's a nice graph showing you financial distress between 2015-16 and 2021-22, when this report was drafted, really a very significant, going below 40% to 60%. In the most recent report now, the 23 State of Local Government Finance Report, it's noted that that figure at the top end has now gone up to 65%. So we are at the end of the 23 financial year. We're looking at about 65% of our municipalities are in conditions of financial distress. In the most recent AG report that was released literally, very recently, we see the AG putting very particular numbers on that as well. And this goes beyond, of course, just financial distress, right? Here we are talking about really these municipalities cannot be considered as going concerns if we put it in commercial terms, that they're just not viable. Now, if these were businesses, if these were corporations, they would have been liquidated, right? That would have been what we're talking about. But this can't happen in the public sector. So we are talking about a significant number of entities that must operate. They must exist, they must be there, but financially, they're not really going concerns. Now, before we get too kind of distressed, mind the pun, about that, this is not a unique South African scenario. We love in South Africa to think that we are absolutely unique and it's only us. No, not at all, not even by a long shot. This is worldwide. This is really a truly global phenomenon, even in places where you would think that there's a lot of money and they don't need to worry about this thing. Absolutely. Just some headlines relating to our book as well. There are classic examples. The US Detroit is probably the best example. And we look in the book at Detroit in some detail. So the city of Detroit went completely bankrupt, utterly, absolutely bankrupt. And there was a massive intervention in Detroit. We discuss it in detail in the book about what happened. But in more recent times, the UK has become really interesting because we are now seeing local councils in the UK fall over financially, the one after another. Some of the really well-known examples that are currently unfolding, these are all current cases. None of them have been resolved. Nottingham has basically said that they're bankrupt, they don't have funds. Croydon, which might not ring a bell, but Croydon is one of the London municipalities, right? So London is not one municipality, it's multiple. Croydon is one of them. They are insolvent. And then the biggest thing, one of course, is Birmingham. Birmingham is essentially insolvent. They cannot meet their obligations. Birmingham is the single largest municipality in Europe. People often find that very strange when you say that. But remember, the big cities, London and Paris and all these things, they're not single municipalities, right? They're not like our metros. They're broken up into, London's got boroughs, so they are different. Birmingham is the single largest municipality. They're just a single one. And they're bankrupt. They're essentially bankrupt, right? So it's not just us. So we looked then at a number of examples. In the book, we then focused on 3 systems. And that's the US, the UK, and South Africa. And we picked these pointedly because they represent 3 very different approaches to dealing with this scenario. So in the US, United States, they've got at the federal level, so that means across all the states, they've got a dedicated set of rules within their insolvency law, in their what they call bankruptcy law. So they've got a bankruptcy code, And Chapter 9 of the US Bankruptcy Code is a dedicated set of insolvency set of rules for municipalities going insolvent. And detailed mechanisms about how to appoint an administrator, how their bankruptcy court, they've got a special court system for bankruptcy, how they become involved, what the oversight mechanisms are. And we discuss this in detail in the book. And then we also illustrate how Chapter 9 of the US Bankruptcy Code has been used in the case of Detroit, for example, but also other case studies to show what could be done, and how could these pressures between creditors on the one hand, but residents on the other, how can this play out? And really interesting questions, really deep questions, but some of them really just almost side issues that one doesn't quite think about, and that the Detroit example really brings home. Is one of the big things in Detroit, for example, was what should happen with Detroit's very significant art collection. So Detroit has got one of the best art collections in the world. They've got an art gallery. It's the property of the city. That's absolutely world class. Serious pieces of art in there, of course, worth a lot. And when Detroit went bankrupt, the question was, well, should it not just sell off that art to be able to pay the creditors? But then the question comes in, well, is that just the city's art? That art in that gallery? Yes, it may be owned by the city, but is it not more than just an asset? Like you and I would have in our houses, and when we, go insolvent, Christie's would come and take the art piece and auction it off and pay our creditors. No issue about it. But in the case of the city, is it not the residents' cultural, more than just an asset? So big debates about that. And Detroit was really interesting in showing how do you deal with that, because it becomes very different when you're talking about a public entity holding something like that, not for its own sake, but really for public cultural benefit. And of course, you can then pull that through to all kinds of services, right? If you start selling off the fire engines, what will happen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So really interesting. Then the second one we looked at is the UK. The UK is on the complete opposite end of the scale. No formal rules on municipal distress in the UK, which is very surprising, because the UK has got one of the most sophisticated and detailed general insolvency in the UK set of rules, business rescue. I mean, the UK, of course, is well known. London is well known as a commercial center. So over, centuries, they've developed a very detailed, sophisticated insolvency law system for normal commerce. And yet, in the municipal context, they've got no rules, really no rules. It's a complete informal system. They operate on the basis that a municipality, a council in the UK, cannot go insolvent. It's not legally possible, because there's an obligation, a statutory obligation on all councils in the UK to balance their budget. So a UK council is legally not allowed to have a deficit on its budget. It just legally not allowed. But of course, practically it happens, right? So what do you do? And then they've got a mechanism under their local government law where the CFO, which is in the UK system really the one in charge of the administration, must issue a so-called Section 114 notice, which will announce to the world that the CFO suspects that in the next budget, they will not be able to balance the budget. They will have more expenditure than income. And that then triggers administrative intervention, which interestingly is not really subject to a lot of law. Basically, it allows the national government, the Secretary of State, to simply just appoint independent commissioners into that municipality that will simply just take over the function, which is very interesting. Not a lot of law there. Very strange things happening, really in the kind of trenches of politics and all of that, and not a very comfortable area to be. And then we've got South Africa, and South Africa is really, really interesting, because we're kind of almost in the middle of that continuum, in the sense that we've designed a dedicated set of rules. We're one of the most developed systems in terms of having written a custom dedicated set of rules just for this context. And I'll just very briefly talk about this, Sean. I don't want to spend too much time on this. People should go and get the book and read the details. But perhaps it might be of interest to those that's not familiar with this space to just very quickly look at some of what we're talking about here. And I'm just going to put this all up. So, I mean, the basics of the South African system is that under our local finance law, so this is completely outside of our insolvency law, outside of our business rescue law. It's completely independent of that, which in itself is incredibly interesting. We've got this dedicated set of rules in the MFMA in Chapter 13 dealing with the resolution of financial problems. In itself, also very interesting. I've got a follow-up article on the book coming out later this year, where I just tracked the development of these set of rules. And it's really interesting to go and look at the process when the MFMA was drafted on this particular chapter. And the very different ideas that were put on the table during this process of a much stronger administration, receivership, something looking a little bit like an insolvency practitioner process, and how that was completely jettisoned for what we've got today. Chapter 13, resolution of financial problems, local government. The three basics of this system is, one, the principle is a municipality is responsible for its own debt. Nobody's going to come to its rescue. That's the first principle. And of course, therein lies also the heart of the problem in South Africa, because that's not, in my opinion at least, a viable point of departure for the South African system, because it hides, in my view, a lot of sin in the original design of our financial system. It's premised on what I consider to be a flawed assumption, which is that municipalities can generate adequate funds themselves to cover their obligations, their public service obligations, which I don't think is true. I think factually it's just incorrect. If we look at the division of revenue, for example, 10%, only 10% of the equitable share goes to local government. But if you look at service delivery, of course, it's the flip side. And we are not a system where that logic of local government being able to operate on a cost recovery basis. So I give you water, you pay for the water. I give you electricity, you pay for electricity. I pick up your rubbish, you pay for it. That's not the reality in South Africa. I don't think it's viable. And that is the design philosophy behind this whole thing. So I think the starting point is flawed, deeply flawed. And as a result, I think what we've seen is a result of that. But anyway, so based on that point of departure, we then have this thing of a financial recovery plan. So when the municipality is then not able to actually fix its own financial distress, you have this mechanism of a financial recovery plan, which is basically an idea or a plan of how are we going to fix this? How are we going to get out of this thing? And it starts on the one end on a voluntary basis. The municipality itself can say, look, these things are not as it should be. We want to go into this process. We want to have a recovery plan. It's a little bit comparable to a business rescue plan. I think for me, that's the interesting part, to start to compare those two. But then it goes all the way to mandatory interventions by provincial and or national government directly under the Constitution, and then also under section, under the MFMA. And this is where we see provincial and national governments then forcing down a financial recovery plan on a municipality. And of course, we've seen a lot of that. Now, when we compare the
whole administration process.
Absolutely. The whole administration, appointing administrator, and I'll talk about that in a second, but I mean, that's the whole process of intervention that we've seen. Now, when we compare this system with, let's call it normal insolvency rules, it's really interesting because there's a fundamental difference. South African insolvency law is quite old-fashioned in the sense that, and you know, it's not just me saying that, it's literally the fact. We've got a 1936 Insolvency Act, 36-8, can't remember, should know that. 1930s, let's just make it safe, a 1930s Insolvency Act, which is hopelessly outdated, and you know, years and years of attempts to update our insolvency laws just not being successful. We've got a completely fragmented system in the sense that our quite recent business rescue procedure was only introduced in 2008 with the New Companies Act, doesn't really talk to insolvency. I mean, these two things live in completely different worlds. They're not under the same regulatory regime. But that whole regime is premised in South Africa on creditor interest. There's no doubt about it. Our courts have said it many times. One of the most celebrated remarks in this regard was this Marshall Industry versus Pillay judgment of 1956, which remains true to this day, where the judge said the Insolvency Act was passed not for the relief of harassed debtors. And this is the position of South African law. Insolvency law is not supposed to be to the benefit of the debtor. It's not supposed to protect the debtor or be to, it's to protect creditors. That's the kind of golden rule almost. So all the mechanisms we've got in our insolvency law are geared to give maximum protection to the creditor. And we don't really care that much about the debtor, right? The debtor is just, which is completely contrary to modern thinking around insolvency. So in the last 4 decades about, globally, the so-called rescue culture has taken hold, where the general thinking now is that it's much better to focus on the debtor and try and rescue the debtor for everyone, the creditors, but also the debtor. And of course, here we need to remember that we're primarily talking here about corporations, right? When individuals go insolvent, yeah, it's a thing, but it's not a big thing in terms of society. But when a huge manufacturing outfit goes insolvent, it's got a huge impact. And we need to be very careful. And again, you know, in South Africa, we see that every day almost. And the global thinking now is that it's much better to gear your law to try and rescue that entity, rather than just throwing it under the bus and say, well, let's just sell off its assets and so be it, which is still the South African position under the insolvency law. But as Rosenstand has argued in this very, very good article of theirs of quite some time ago, is that under the municipal system, this financial distress, Chapter 13, creditor interest is really not paramount. In fact, it's not really a significant interest. And in our book, we also go into that in quite some detail, and we show how really creditors are not all that important when we think in South Africa about municipal distress. We don't protect them really particularly well. They don't really get much of a say in the whole process. They are really very much secondary. But of course, that's got real implications for the commerce, right? For who is prepared to engage with a municipality. So if you think procurement again, you know, who is prepared to bid for a municipal tender when you are worried that this municipality might not be financially solid? And because as a creditor, potential creditor, as a supplier, you don't enjoy a lot of protection under the system, there's a huge risk for you there. And of course, that could have, just as an immediate conclusion, that could have one of two consequences. Either you simply do not participate, which means that our pool of suppliers to the state is immediately reduced, which is not good for the system. Or if you do participate, you do so at higher prices because you need to cover that risk. So we end up paying more in the public sector. And just as a very small aside, I mean, it's not part of this book, but I think it's a really important point to make from a procurement perspective, Sean, is that We love in this country to run around and say in procurement, oh, we need to buy at market prices. Why are you not buying at market prices? Why did you buy this pen that I can buy for 10 Rand at the retailer for 15 Rand? Then we go crazy. But what we forget is that it's because of rules like this that the risk profile of selling this pen to the municipality is very different from selling this pen to a private corporation. Same pen, but the risk profile is different. Now, any sensible business person takes risk into account when you determine your price. So if I'm sensible as a business person, I will charge the state more for this pen, especially if I'm selling to a municipality, than to the private company in the building right next door to the municipality, because the risk profiles are very different. This is one very important one. If that private business goes bankrupt, I've got protection in insolvency law. If the municipality goes bankrupt, financial distress, it's a risk. I must suck it up. Of course, I'm going to cost that risk, right? So just as an aside, that's one reason why that whole argument is just silly. And I think it's just not understanding what we're talking about. But of course, we know that this whole system in South Africa is premised actually on the Constitution, right? So we've got this idea of intervention under Section 139 of the Constitution, and then that's built out under 136, where you've got both discretionary and mandatory interventions, both provincial and national government. Now, what does this look like? Very briefly, it involves this financial recovery plan. If it's voluntary, so if a municipality says, please put me under, I want recovery, any person can be appointed to do this. But if it's mandatory, it must be done by the Municipal Finance Recovery Service within National Treasury, dedicated service. They must actually coordinate at least. They still use consultants to do it so, but it goes through National Treasury. And then we see under the MFMA Section 141 that there's a whole list of entities that must be consulted. And I think this is interesting and important to look at, because if you look at it, you'll see that credit is just one category amongst a large number that this person that's now going to prepare the financial recovery plan must talk to. But very interestingly, if you look at 141.3A2, you see the obligation on this practitioner who's going to craft this business, this financial recovery plan to go and talk to creditors is limited to the extent they can reasonably be contacted. So you don't even have to, you just kind of, can I find them? And then I chat to them and that's that, which is very different from business rescue or insolvency, where you cannot proceed if you don't have the creditors on board. We've got multiple layers of protection there. So it's really a different system. What I find most interesting really in this space is how we actually then intervene. So we appoint an administrator in the worst cases. So in the worst cases where we see this, the municipality is just not getting there, we appoint an administrator. And of course, we've seen many of these over the years in South Africa. But what is critical is that that administrator steps into the shoes of the council. So we dissolve the council and we put the administrator in the place of the council. And the administrator takes over temporarily the functions of the council, but not the municipal manager. Now, to my mind, that makes no sense whatsoever. That's like saying, I will keep the CEO of the company in place, this one that's now driven this company into the ground. I will go and sit in the shareholders' board position, and I will wait. It makes no sense, right? And we've seen in practice how this turns out. Administrator shows up, MM says, well, I'm not interested. Go away. Just as I wasn't interested in what the council said or didn't say, I run my own show, go away. And of course, this is also just temporary, right? Very much unlike the private context. It's just temporary until a new election, until a new council is elected, which may be the very same council that was just ousted, because this is a process of elections, right? So there's no guarantee that it's going to be anyone different. We have recently in case law, this one from the Constitutional Court, the Premier Gauteng DA case, around Tshwane, we've seen that the court has said, look, this should really be a last resort. You should really try and do other things first before you do this. But of course, you know, this is called comfort because we know that these recovery plans are not working. They're just not generating any results. In the book, for example, we look in quite some detail at Mangaung, which has now been under administration for many years. We look at Kanaland, which is a really interesting example. Kanaland is now coming up for their second full council term under administration. So they've now basically gone through 2 complete administrations under administration with no real solution in sight. So I think it's clear that these mechanisms are not. Yeah. There are very, very limited debt restructuring options, but very, very limited. And I think that's also at the heart of the problem. It is possible to get a stay, a suspension, or even a termination of obligations. So now we're talking about the municipality as a debtor being able to get out of its debt. A creditor basically losing out, as would be a case under a liquidation. And then a distribution scheme. But again, we don't have rules on that. There's supposed to be regulations on that. They do not exist, right? So we're not seeing this happening. We don't know. How are we actually going to have a distribution scheme in a municipality? What would that look like? And we've not really gone into that space. So if we look at the practice of all of this, really not successful. If you go and look, and in the book we look at some of this. So Pari did a great study, this Mind the Gap, and you can Google it. It's freely online, where they did a very thorough study on interventions between 1998 and 2017. There were 140 of those interventions. And you see the quote there, very few of these have had a meaningful and sustained impact on municipal operations or financial health. In many instances, the municipality is in a worse position after the intervention than it was before. So really just not working. They're not coming out of this process more healthy. Treasury in 2020 itself said that 1 in 5 municipalities at that stage was under administration. Municipal debt, 67 billion in 2020. Now, I can tell you more recent figures suggest that that is probably doubled. There was a 19.8 billion increase in Q1 of 2021. And if you just look at the revenue expenditure there, we don't even have to go into solvency ratios or liquidity ratios or anything more sophisticated. Just look at the revenue and the expenditure, and you can see where this story is going, right? If we've got revenue of 484 billion and we've got expenditure of 489 billion, there's only one direction where this thing can go, right? It can't work. It's just not viable. And then we see the same story now in the most recent AG report.
Yeah.
This is a direct quote. Those few entities that the AG is now saying they're not running concerns, right? They're just not running concerns. Of the 50, only about half, 27, has got financial recovery plans in place. And that's counting all of them. And we know that a lot of them is just not worth the paper they're written on, right? So even half of them are not even under this process. So this is just not working. So the last point I just want to touch on, Sean, and this is where I think the research is heading. This is what we're kind of trying to tease out with the book and the work that we're doing on the back of this book, is to understand whether a dedicated set of rules like this can work, and if not, as the South African example seems to suggest that it's not working, what are the tweaks that we need to make? What are the issues? And I think these are some of the issues that we're pointing out when we compare municipal distress rules with normal commercial distress rules. That's insolvency and business rescue on the other side. We see that there are no special powers for creditors, and I think that is concerning. If we think procurement, that should concern us. If we remind ourselves that we spend about R1 trillion of our annual budget through procurement, and we are price sensitive, we need to think about, what does that mean? What does it mean when we don't give adequate protection to creditors? What does that do to our budget? And of course, it's not just the budget we're concerned about, right? It's the public services that must be delivered through that budget. And I think that's a serious question we need to ask ourselves. I think that there are some serious questions to be asked about financial recovery plans. Who are in charge? What are their skill sets? If we compare that to the situation in insolvency and business rescue, it is a bit shocking that we just basically allow anyone to do this, whereas now with insolvency and business rescue, very strict requirements about who can be an insolvency practitioner, who can be a business rescue practitioner. The master wouldn't just allow anyone to take on an insolvent or a distressed company. So why are we just seemingly not putting more strict rules in place about who can take on a municipality that's distressed? That's a much more complex environment. So I think there's a gap there. We've got no prescripts on who these administrators or trustees could be. They could basically be anyone. We don't know what are their credentials, what are they subject to. Must they be professionals? Must they be subject to some ethical code? I would think so, but we've got nothing in place. I think, as I've said, this whole thing of replacing the council and leaving the MM in place is madness. I think it's setting these poor administrators up for failure. And then, of course, the big issue is that in local government, there's no backstop, right? There's no final end. Nobody's got really an incentive to solve this problem. In corporate distress, the incentive is insolvencies, liquidation. If you don't make the business rescue plan work, you will be liquidated. That's it. So everybody's got an incentive to make the business rescue work. But of course, there's no such thing in local government, right? So whether the financial recovery plan works or doesn't work, oh, well, So I think we really need to think about a backstop. We need to create a mechanism that will create the kind of incentives to say, look, if this recovery plan does not work, if you don't do what's necessary, this is going to be the result, and it needs to be at that level of liquidation. Of course, we cannot stop the services, but I don't think that necessarily means we must have the same local government. I think that there are options that we can start to play with to say, okay, perhaps we completely dissolve the municipality, completely. And we have another level of government simply take that over until we can get to a more viable design, whatever that might be. But I mean, these are some of the ideas. And then the final few points, what do I think we should do? I think these are the reform things that we need to consider. And I think now that we are seemingly in a season where we're going to revisit the MFMA, I think these are, if we're going to retain Chapter 13 in its current form, I think these are the things that we should at least be thinking about. Definitely more defined role for creditors, stricter control about who can be involved in the recovery plan, but also as an administrator. We need to think about adjusting this intervention power and administration functions. It must be able to take the operations of the municipality over effectively. It can't just come in at the oversight function. And I think we need to think about a backstop, some liquidation option to really serve as the end, to say, look, this is not going to work. I'm not sure what that could be, but I think we need to think about. And then with that, Sean, anyone interested in the book, there's a QR code for you. I think you've also posted the link into the chat. The book is open access available due to, and big thanks to a very generous contributions made by the University of Essex and my own university, Stellenbosch University, to basically pay Edward Elgar to make the book freely available to anyone to download. we were very adamant right from the start that this book is not going to have the effect and impact we would hope it to have if we ask people to pay a lot of money for it. So it is freely available. You just go online. If you go to elgaronline.com, just search for it. It'll pop up, or just scan that QR code and it will take you directly to the link. Sean has also posted the link in the chat. And then you can literally just download the book in PDF, or just certain chapters of the book in PDF from the website, and read the book and let me know what you think. I'm, of course, always very interested to hear your thoughts. Where you think we got it utterly wrong, please tell us. That's one of the beauties of being academic. I can just say, oh, I got it wrong. Okay, this is not what we think. And this is ongoing work. So I would love to hear from anyone on where do we go with this? What do we do with this? Thank you, Sean.
Very, very interesting. Thank you very much, Prof Quinot. Couple of questions. And I'm going to ask Helen Fenter to come in and ask her question, but also I think Helen is also involved in putting together financial recovery plans for municipalities. So Helen, if you wouldn't mind maybe just engaging a little bit on that. You're asking the question, are there case studies where the financial recovery plan was successful? If you hang on a sec, Helen, I must just allow everyone to unmute. So there we are. If you can come in, Helen.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Good morning. Welcome.
Thank you, and thanks, Prof. I wasn't even aware that you're involved in this process. Obviously, from my perspective, I'm more involved on the ground level, not necessarily on an academic level. And we work very closely then with National Treasury. And the MFRS team normally focus on 4 pillars. We look at it from a governance perspective, institutional, financial, where we determine then ratios, and then service delivery. And there's very specific parameters that we look at for financial recovery. But then having said that, I fully agree with you. Currently, it feels like it's a paper exercise, a tick box exercise, where we identify the root causes, we identify recovery actions, but then we leave it to the exact same people who caused the distress to fix it. And it's extremely frustrating, and that led to my question to ask you, do you know of any case study where it's been successfully done? And at this stage, I have not feel it. I literally feel that I'm doing a paper exercise. So I agree with you. I think there's very critical questions to ask. And then coming back to what you've said is, maybe it will result in a change in the constitution if you want to take over some of those powers.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I'm adding to your...
No, absolutely. I mean, thanks for that, Helen. I mean, it's always, as an academic, it's always great to get that kind of input from a practitioner, because it means I didn't completely miss the boat. But yeah, I mean, that's certainly, what you're saying kind of rhymes with what we find in the book. Look, the one case study that is held up as a success is Cedarburg Municipality. I've not studied it empirically, so I cannot myself say that it was a success, but I've read a couple of other studies that suggest that Cedarburg was, in fact, a successful intervention. I think one of the things in Cedarburg that one must perhaps go and look at, and I might still do this in a future bit of research, is the question of causation. Some of the things that I've read suggest to me that one must perhaps go and ask a few additional questions. It might be, I'm not saying it is, please don't get me wrong, not done the research. This is pure hypotheses on my side, but it might be a case of correlation does not equate to causation. I think, based on what I've seen that happened in Cedarburg generally, that there might have been multiple variables at play at the same time. So I think some of the ostensible success of Cedarburg might be attributable to the financial recovery process, some to other factors. I don't know. But that is, at least in the South African system, one example that is referred to as one where it did work, where things did change positively. But unfortunately, it's a rare exception.
We will just assume that Advocate Venter was part of the team. But you don't have to respond to that. Let's go to Gao Mulalekwa. Good morning, Gao.
Good morning, Sean.
Good morning.
Good morning, Prof. Thanks for sharing the insights of the book. May I ask, your ESG approach, why does it not include the economic environment of where the municipality is established? Because one of the major sources of revenue for a municipality is own revenue, which means the people that are getting the services should be able to pay. Now, I'm just wondering, why are you only looking at environmental, social, and governance? Or maybe the economic portion is involved in the social. Maybe you'll just explain, or I'll read it myself from the book. Then you made an international or global comparison. I haven't read the book yet or had a chance to read the book yet, and thanks for making it available to us. I will just go and read that for myself. But just from the top of your head, those international institutions, UK, America, and the other, do they have the same DORA structure as South Africa? Because the revenue of the South African municipalities is threefold. It's equitable share, own revenue, and conditional grants. Are they operating from the same level? Maybe we should just maybe, but I'll read it for myself.
Good questions.
Then one challenge that I'm having, Prof, is with your section, or should I say chapter 8 of the MFMA, which talks to the responsibilities of municipal officials. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that why would you have an administrator when there is law that says officials with the accounting officer, which is the MM, having responsibilities and there is no consequence management? You leave the people who ran this thing into the ground and you remove people who are political. I have a challenge there, because it means then there's no consequence management. But probably it is because of my first question. We have placed the CEO in a non-functional municipality. We are acknowledging that indirectly and saying we can't really hold this person responsible because this municipality was established in a jurisdictional area that could not or would not be able to assemble enough own revenue to survive.
Yeah.
Good.
I have a whole lot of other things. Does your book also cover the culture of non-payment for services? Remember, we come from that culture.
Yeah.
Did you deal with it? Did we inform people that now that it is our own government, should we be paid? And then, yeah, budget
good.
approach versus cash flow approach. I have a challenge there, but yeah, I have a whole lot of issues, Prof. But thanks for the book. It puts some direction in what you should be and should not be doing. Thanks a lot, Sean. Thanks, Prof.
Good one, Gao. Thank you.
Thank you, Gao. I mean, absolutely. Let me just start by saying you're putting your finger on all exactly the right questions. And these are all questions that we are grappling with in this project at various points. Some of these are picked up on in the book to show these are the pressure points. These are the things that you need to think about when designing a set of rules like this. And we use some of them in the book to show how while on paper, and it comes really a little bit back to Helen's point as well, on paper, chapter 13 of the MFMA seems really good, right? It seems, I mean, if I talk to foreign colleagues, they look at chapter 13, they think, whoa, this is brilliant. And then I say, well, whoa, curb your enthusiasm. Let me show you the practice, right? And then you start to have conversations about it. And these questions you ask are exactly the kind of questions that you then need to interrogate, because as I think all your questions point out, it's a question of the ecosystem. It's not a question of just an individual instance or something happening. It's an ecosystem question, and you need to understand your intervention and how you're going to deal with this issue at the ecosystem level, which is why we wanted to use an ESG framework, which is an ecosystem-based lens approach, to say, let's look at the totality. And that then really answers your first question. Yes, the economic is absolutely part of that ESG lens. So when we look at environmental, social governance across all three of them, the local economic conditions would be a key consideration across the board, right? So you need to consider what are the local conditions economically also. So, for example, one of the things that we touch on across all the case studies in the book, but certainly also the South African one, is to talk about the implications for local economic development of insolvency. So just generally, what is the effect, for example, of a big employer in a fairly small town going insolvent? And how have we started to think about that from an insolvency or business rescue perspective, right? So there's some interesting evidence that we start to think about it differently. We start to think, for example, about a retention of jobs as an important consideration. Now, from those experiences, we can pull into the municipal context also important lessons to say, hang on, you know, you need to think about the local economic conditions and what the impact is going to be. So I think that it is undoubtedly an important element. When you look at the book, you will see also that we suggest in the chapter on South Africa, where we look at Kannaland, that perhaps the real story behind Kannaland is a question about the economic viability of the unit altogether. And that no measure of intervention is ever going to change that. You have to go back to design. You have to say, because of a lot of factors. So in Kannaland, it's a lot of urbanization that's having a very negative effect on local economic conditions. What you're left with is an aging population with high public service needs, but very limited revenue potential. Huge areas that needs to be serviced, but sparsely populated. What is the impact on that for the economic viability of Kannaland as a unit? And we use it just as a case study. That story, I think we can tell many times over in our country. And that's something that we have to think about, right? So then we say to each other, look, it's not about the economic, the financial distress of a municipality as is. It might go all the way back to the design board. When you drew these lines, you didn't take this sufficiently into account, and as a result, this entity cannot work. And there, you know, we started suggesting, and this is also ongoing work, looking at models where, for example, there's been just amalgamation. So that's happened in the UK a lot, where you just amalgamate. You come to a point where you say, this unit is not financially viable. It can never exist on its own. So you need to merge it with something else to make it work. But that comes with its own set of difficulties, right? But there's work there. In the comparative work, absolutely, we are doing a lot of work at the moment. That's why we brought public finance people and accountants into the mix, because we absolutely agree that a lot of these issues and a lot of the potential solutions exist at the budgetary level, the public budgetary level. So a lot of these things are functions of how your budgetary process work. In our case, the division of revenue, not just the actual division on an annual basis, but just the design of how we do it as well. As I've said at the beginning, I think there's a flawed assumption there in the South African system, and that explains a lot of the difficulties we have. So we do touch on it in the book, where we, for example, look at the US. That's got a very different way of thinking about public finance, and then that's got all kinds of implications for who is responsible. So if you've got a different budgetary model, it means that you can put also responsibility for creditors somewhere else, and that becomes quite interesting. So we do touch on that, but of course that is an important part of the story. And as you also point out, then part of that story in South Africa in particular, and we do point it out in the book, is that you know, if you don't have this idea of payment for services, what happens? Right now, that plays in then on another angle, which in South Africa is an important angle, and that is that, and again, we touch on it in the book, is that municipalities in South Africa do not have a lot of freedom to stop providing services, which is in other systems the solution. You say, well, if you don't pay for this, you're not going to have it, right? So you just, in the UK, for example, they now just won't be nice community centers anymore because we can't afford it. Full stop. That's it. If you don't pay for it, you don't have it. In South Africa, we run now increasingly into the difficulty where, for example, courts would say it is the municipality's obligation, full stop. It's a constitutional obligation. They cannot get out of it. Whether people pay for it or not is beside the point. But of course, that's easy to say. What do you do then? Right? Where's the money going to come from?
Yeah.
So it's a very live question. And then the final, I mean, I don't think it was a question. It was just, and I fully agree with you. We need to think about the institutional interventions. We need to think about how do we position interventions, administration, recovery plans, and the operational part of a municipality. I think, practically speaking, that is probably one of the reasons why most of these things have not worked. That there's just, one's not been able to force down the plan on the operations of a municipality in the same way that you can do in all forms of private financial distress, whether it's business rescue then or in the end liquidation. All of those can be forced down. You can't in our current design. I think that's a design flaw.
Prof, was there a comparison that was done on this non-payment issue? Are there other municipalities where collection is a large part of the problem? Or was it fairly unique to South Africa?
Not in this study. So between these three systems, in the UK and the US, they don't have anything comparable to that. They just don't face that kind of reality. What they do face, which is comparable, is less the cultural element, which we've got, and more just an indigent dimension, right? People are just not able to pay. It's not a matter of don't wanting to pay. You're just not able to. And then indigent policies coming to really bear on this, and then cross-subsidization, all of that coming into the picture as well. So we've seen some of that. That's comparable. But of course, in South Africa, we've got that additional kind of cultural line to it, or it's not cultural, it's more kind of historical, institutional element. Of course, what is also interesting in South Africa, that we don't find in the other two, is the fact that we do have very violent reaction
responses
to these failures.
Fascinating. Michael? Michael's joining us from a very viable municipality down in the Eastern Cape.
Oh, yeah. We pay 40 million rand for holes in the ground. Prof, sorry, I just would like to ask a question. I mean, there is a malaise, and that's the infiltration of politics at technocrat level. And we're not going to get away from it unless at some stage South Africa decides we're going to draw a line in the sand and saying we cannot continue looking back. We've got to take what's good from the past 30 years and then change what's bad and then build from there onwards. But is it viable at the moment to have these demarcation systems where you need one councillor every 7,500 or 9,500 residents? I mean, can a small municipality in the Eastern Cape support 100 councillors that ratepayers have to pay for? Should those be only 10 or 12? I mean, and what suffers at the end of the day is delivery. On my side, you know, if I look at the infrastructure, Alison Lawless, you might be familiar with, prepared a book called Numbers and Needs. And it's a fantastic book. It says, you know, if you've got so many kilometers of roads, you need this and you need that and so on. And that kind of principle could be extended to all municipal departments and say, let's have a system that is viable, not only financially, because if you don't have ratepayers, you can't fabricate money. But at the moment, you know, municipalities don't spend their money. Councillors couldn't care less because it's not their money. Municipal officials aren't accountable for the money they waste. And it's just never going to get better unless we find a way of changing what's there, because I can't see how our current system is going to improve.
Yeah. Yeah, Mike, I mean, I fully agree with you. I mean, I think for me, you know, it's probably a much bigger conversation that we need to have in South Africa. I think we are 30 years in. I think it's time for us to revisit, in my view, the institutional dimension of our democracy fairly fundamentally. And I think the starting point of that revisit exercise must be to acknowledge firstly that the pressures under which we designed the current system in 1990 to 94 do not exist anymore. They're simply not present. So with that in mind, how can we now design a different institutional architecture? Now, perhaps very controversially, but I remain convinced of it, is perhaps we should do away with provincial governments. I'm not sure they serve any useful purpose anymore. And just have two levels. We're a country that, you know, is resource constrained in the public sector. I think we spend too much money on administration and bureaucracy and too little on public service. So let's cut out some of those levels. Let's have a strong local level for pure delivery and a strong national level for planning. And that's that. I mean, that's a model that exists across the world. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We're not a federation. We know it's never going to be a federation. So I mean, I think that for me is a starting point. And when you do that, I think then we can start to think about, okay, what can we then do at a local level to make these things work better? I think the idea of a district can work, not under current conditions, because they're just trying to replicate what provinces are meant to do at the moment. So I think they're not going to add anything. They're going to waste more. But I think the idea of a district in a binary system makes a lot of sense, because now you can start do pooling and all of that. But then we need to clear the way for pooling, right? So just pooling, if you just think about, you know, procurement again, because we're a platform that's primarily interested in procurement, just pooling procurement across locals in a district is incredibly difficult in this country. It is, you know, it's ridiculous how difficult it is. It should be much easier. Those are the kind of things that I think we need to pay attention to. I think that if we do that kind of thing, we can also start to really look at how much do we pay public representatives? How many of them do we actually need? To what extent can these things be done by ward committees where people serve on a voluntary basis? They're not paid for it. You serve because it's your community. That's what you do. Is that not our culture? I think so. I truly believe that we are a country where there's a strong sense of communitarianism. I don't think we need to pay people to serve the public interest. I think we need to get back to that. So I think those are some of the things that I think we need to do.
Yeah.
But there are, of course, I mean, these are huge questions, right? These are not, and they've got multiple dimensions.
Yeah.
It's just one of them. And of course, many others need to be taken into account. But look, we are having a national dialogue soon, so perhaps this will be one of the things that we can talk about.
You're going to have to be up there. Let's last
Not
one,
a
Carl.
chance.
Last one, Carl.
Thanks, Sean, for giving me the last chance. Prof, your book could have just as well read Government in Distress, in Financial Distress. And
Interesting.
I'm saying this because our Department of Health is in the same position. And unfortunately, we can't close our hospitals and the clinics. Again, I'm referring to Chapter 8 of the MFMA. In the PFMA space, you are told that the accounting officer cannot issue or publish a tender if they know that they do not have a budget. Now, municipalities end up in financial distress because an MM published a tender knowing that they do not have the cash flow or the budget to finance that tender. Shouldn't we, from a commercial point of view and commercial law point of view and law of contract, then be saying the tender did not publish itself? Somebody needs to take accountability. And again, I'm saying there is a solution in Chapter 8. There is somebody who must take the responsibility. And our courts must use that to recover for the creditors. Thanks.
Good one. And I'm going to allow Andres to come in. Response here?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. I fully agree with it. But I mean, what I would say is that, yes, we need to do that. And these things, I don't think they are exclusive the one of the other. I think it's absolutely essential that where we've got mechanism, we need to we need to hold people accountable. What I think I'm more interested in this book and the work we're doing now is to get ahead of the problem. And to say, you know, some of these things are results of how the system is set up, right? How, and I mean, let's take your exact same point. If we put an MM in charge of a municipality that you and I can say is never going to be financially viable, right? How fair is it to hold that person accountable for failing to deliver public service? And I think for me, that's part of the story. Yes, we should absolutely hold that person accountable. In metros, for example, I think there's no excuse. But I think some of the other issues are design problems, and we need to get on the front end of them to say, okay, how can we change the design? How can we set these entities up in a way that's going to perhaps allow for greater viability and not end up in financial distress? And I think those are different dimensions of the same problem that must be dealt with differently. So I think there's space for all of that in the equation. Let me just also say, I'm not in favor of where our court seems to be going now, by just holding everyone accountable and wanting to send everyone to court and seize their pension. And I don't think that's the solution. What we're going to see is we're going to see a flight of qualified, well-intentioned people out of the public service. Those that will remain will just have such a chilling effect that they won't touch anything. I, for one, if I were to work now for any of these entities, I will refuse to serve on a BEC or BAC. Unless it's in my employment contract, I would say, sorry, I'm not touching that thing with a pole. The risk is too high. I don't think the system is protecting me enough to be able to do that, that job. And I don't think that's a solution at a systems level. Does it mean we shouldn't hold those few rotten apples to account? Absolutely not. They should just be put in orange overalls immediately. But I don't think it's a system solution.
You've just scared off all the BAC and BEC.
Oh, my apologies for that, colleagues. Do serve on your BAC and BAC.
Please.
We need you, otherwise we're not going to go forward.
Andres, last one. Andres, Eastern Cape Provincial Treasury.
I'm fairly certain that Andres is going to take me on some of my views.
No, not today. I am going to offer you to please involve me in taking this topic forward. And I think what I've got to say would also encourage that. Firstly, I want to congratulate you for picking a topic that basically represents the scariest monster in the Pandora's box of government failures. The one thing I do like what you mentioned, obviously I'm talking from a perspective of the presentation, not having read the book yet. I can assure you I will promote the book to be read by everybody in the province as far as I can and send it to all forums. I like the concept of protecting not just protecting the creditor, but save the debtor. Rescue is better than liquidation. Which does make our laws quite progressive, but then at the same time, as you've mentioned, that there's a gap, there's a hole in the system that makes it not work the way it should work. Having worked in the governance space and in one of the more notorious provinces, as Sean has introduced me, I've seen things go horribly wrong, both from a provincial government perspective, as well as being a ratepayer in one of the dysfunctional municipalities in the province. So again, I think you're on the money when it comes to your analysis of the problem. And I think as South Africans, we are incredibly good in analyzing problems. It's fixing them that's always the challenge. I really like the fact that one of your observations is that the rescue and service delivery is the modern perspective. As a matter of fact, liquidating a municipality in South Africa makes the ratepayer a triple victim, because he firstly doesn't get what he paid for. Then, and so he parts with his money, he gets no service delivery. So that's a double whammy already. And then if you should you liquidate that municipality, it disenfranchise him from any form of recourse, and they end up having to pay a third time, or being a victim a third time by contributing to the residents association that ends up fixing the potholes. I'm just using that as a bit of a tongue in cheek, but the reality is the problem is dire, and I think it's quite. I'm going to promote this specifically to my colleagues in the province by saying, and we thought we're the only ones. That the problem is actually an international problem. And then the other big thing, and you've touched on that, that debt, borrowing money is a process of kicking the can down the road. If you don't have the money now, you will never have the money. And I think this is where a lot of government institutions has made the mistake. In a growing economy, you can get away with it for a while, but in a stagnant or a shrinking economy, debt is your worst enemy. Then, as a final thought, having done a lot of research in the risk management space in the government environment, I originally started off with a very narrow view of why things go wrong, and that is poor risk management, that the system is designed not to factor in all the risks, and it's not dealing with all the risks, and therefore it's failing, which turned out to be, as I said, a narrow-minded view. A bigger problem is the overall strategy is flawed. Basically, you're taking on more than you're able to afford, which does speak to the political objectives, the payment of councillors, and even the South African labor regime. All of them is making doing business in South Africa for the normal business in the street difficult. For government institutions, it just creates impossible to navigate kind of environment. But then the third one, and this is where I will end my comment, is that, and this is the one that I would like us to maybe, if time allows, at the next stage, talk to as well, is what I refer to as the third reason for failure is the human factor. You can have the best plans, systems, processes, IT, you call it what you want. If people do not do what they're supposed to do, failure is imminent.
Yeah.
And I think that's the largest problem in this current regime. And one can only coin it by, say, a lack of ethics. I think the old municipalities, both international as well as local, were institutions that was built on the pride of a town or the pride of a community. The proudest oak in town was always the mayor. He was walking around with robes and looking very important. And it was that pride that made people work together to the common good, where I think somewhere pride has been replaced with greed. And now we have a big problem. And I don't think the solution is more governance, more laws, more rules.
No.
Remember, the first sin was committed when the first rule was made. So more rules just equals more breaking of rules. We need to come up with an ideology, if I want to say that, of getting people to take ownership of their local environment and start being a community that fix their environment. Sorry for that speech.
Thank you.
But this was an incredibly interesting topic. And as I said again, you've got the Eastern Cape behind you on this one. I will definitely promote the book on all the forums I can. And I think you guys are doing a great job. Unfortunately, it's a beginning of a long journey, that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres.
Thank you. Prof, if you would also just wrap up in your response to Andres, just telling us where to next.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, I think Andres has put his finger on all the important aspects. I think there's so much there to explore exactly where we want to go next. There are many angles to this across many different disciplines. I mean, one of the things that in the broader project we're also very adamant about is that we need to move away from a single disciplinary perspective. I think one of the points that Andres made right at the end, we can't look at this just as a legal problem and now we throw more law at it and we think that the outcome is going to be different. That's never going to work. So it must be multidisciplinary. That's why we put the project together. We're really very actively bringing loads of other disciplines on board to say, let's understand these things together. So at the moment, we are working very closely with the finance people, the accountants in the public sector to say, let's understand public finance. Let's understand the workings of public money. And again, you know, there's a lot there. How does, bond markets work? How do they respond to these kind of things? How do we make it more viable? I mean, the point that Andres made about taking just more debt, that's the UK story at the moment, and it's not working. But there's also a huge appetite for things like green bonds, for example. So how do we leverage that to our benefit? How do we create new revenue streams that can offset reductions in the ability of users to pay? So the user pay principle is probably not viable anymore. And those are the kind of things that we are also grappling with. I mean, this particular work continues. We continue to unpack all of this. You asked the question earlier on, how do we define financial distress? We've got a very basic definition. But one of the things in our project that we just want to say is, let's just work conceptually. Let's just try and understand, what is financial distress? Well, when we talk globally about financial distress, what is it? The other angle that we've just very recently started also within the broader project to look at is, of course, to bring, and this is a whole another year's worth of talking, is state-owned entities and bring them alongside this conversation. Because again, as is in South Africa the case, next to municipalities, those are the big spenders. Those are the big public entities in the market. So if we're serious about understanding a developmental state where you've got the market and the public sector working hand in glove, that's the other one you need to understand. You need to understand SOCs, and it's also true in South Africa. So that's also a line that we're going to pick up now and start to think about, how do we deal with SOCs in financial distress? What are the mechanisms there? So a lot of things coming out. Please go and also visit our project's website. We very often have, in fact, this Friday, we've got a very nice webinar coming up. They're always just, you just join. We post the stuff on YouTube as well after the fact. If you're just interested in listening what other people think about where this is going globally, it is a global conversation. So let's participate in that global conversation. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Next week, let me just quickly stop